I'm just trying to make sure that all of our panelists are on. Laura is here, Galip is there, and here is Jonathan. So we have three extremely qualified speakers. My colleague Jonathan Katz has been a long-time observer of Turkish issues in Washington, D.C., and actually for some period he also worked directly on Turkey. And then we have Laura Batalla, who despite her young age has tremendous experience working on Turkey in Brussels. And she will, by the way, she will be speaking in her own capacity and not as a representative of the European Parliament. And then we have my friend Galip Dalay, who is jack of all trades and also master of quite a few. So although, of course, the focus of the discussion is on Turkey, I would like to start with Jonathan and with US politics. So Jonathan, the United States is preparing for elections in November. What does the political situation look like? How does COVID play a role? And what do the odds look like?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. And hello to all of our other panelists and for GMF, you know, obviously in Washington and in Ankara, Turkey remains a central focal point for the work that we're doing. The U.S. election, Özgür, you said it correctly. Right now, we're looking ahead to November 3rd. It's hard 5.5 months out before the election to completely make a prediction. And when people try to do that, oftentimes they're wrong. But we have a different scenario today than we did 3 months ago, where you have over the last 8 weeks, you have over 30 million newly unemployed in the United States. Over the last 4 weeks, it's been 20 million. And so I think what you're seeing is a dynamic in the United States where you have two candidates right now, the presumptive nominee, Joe Biden, the former vice president, and you have the current president, Donald Trump, right now, facing an electoral season like none other that I've been part of. And in my previous experience, I worked as a campaign manager, working congressional and presidential campaigns. So I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like this before, where the candidates themselves can't actually physically shake the hands of people because there aren't public events, there aren't big speeches in the public. And so you're seeing a lot of the election play out in social media right now. So let's actually just turn to where the numbers are, because I think that's really important. Obviously, before the coronavirus, President Trump faced, significant odds to win again based on the numbers where he was in terms of favorable, unfavorable, which have remained steady for quite some time. Many of us forget, and it's quite extraordinary, that for the last several months before the coronavirus, there was an impeachment investigation and a vote in the House and a vote in the Senate. The House convicted, the Senate did not. And so the president faced significant odds at the time. I think the bigger question for the Democrats in the US leading up to where we are today was who would be the nominee. And so that landscape changed dramatically from February, where many believed that Bernie Sanders would end up being the nominee based on what he was doing in states. Then we came to South Carolina primary. And for all those the United States has many arcane systems, but one in particular is this primary system. And Joe Biden won a very important election in South Carolina that propelled him today to be the nominee. So when we start to look at the numbers, and I think it's really important, there's a couple of factors. We look at the battleground states that in the last election in 2016 that Hillary Clinton won, did not win, where Donald Trump won, that Biden would need to likely win in order not only to win the popular vote. And by the way, if I can make one prediction that I think is going to be 100% accurate, is that Joe Biden will win the popular vote. But everyone knows, if you don't know, in the US political system, you also have to win the electoral college. That means you need these 270 electoral votes. It's based state by state. I won't get into it completely because I think it would take too long to do that while we have this in place. But if you look at the map of the states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida. If you start to look at the numbers, you see that Joe Biden is leading in a number of states that he would need to win in November to win the presidency. And so why is this change? Like, what has changed really on the map? It's the economy. And President Trump's biggest calling card prior to the coronavirus was that he built this great economy. The US was back globally. People were making money hand over fist. Unemployment levels were at all-time lows. Today, unemployment levels went from in the 3s to now into 14% and more. It's likely more than that because it's not being calculated completely who's lost these jobs. If the current situation remains, and based on the coronavirus and the unknowns of what will take place, it's very likely that Trump can't come back from this type of an economic downturn to be able to win. And when you start to look at voters, at US voters, when they ask the question about who do you trust in terms of their response to the coronavirus, Trump is in the low 40s, 41%, which kind of mirrors where he is in terms of job approval rating. There's much more faith in governors. You see high percentages of support for US governors in the response to the coronavirus, high response for health officials, but Trump really has received low grades. And this has impacted him. And you can already see, even amongst Republicans, hardcore Republicans, you see a slight decline in support for Trump, where you see it inching down 5 to 6%. And really where he's being hit is independents. In independents, he has been incredibly hurt by what's taken place. When you look at how independents view Trump and his response to the coronavirus, it's very similar to what you see in Democrats. So this November, it's hard to predict, hard to look into the crystal ball to know exactly what's going to happen. One thing I know about Trump is that he never stops looking to find a way to achieve his objectives, which is to win the White House. I think he wants to do that not only to keep himself in power, but I think he also fears potential prosecution after he leaves office. And so the expectation is that we'll likely see some type of action. Just a couple quick things too, before I turn it back to you. One, we don't know if there'll be similar type of interference in the elections that we saw in 2016. Already US intelligence, even over the last couple of months, said there is already been interference, foreign interference. Trump has not really ever spoken out about that. And so the expectation is there'll likely be some type of interference in the election. And the other thing is, we don't know if there will be any other what we call black swan events, something so significant before the election. I thought the coronavirus is really the black swan event for every politician globally. And you can see this in Turkey, Russia. You can see it in a number of countries too, where the politics of coronavirus are changing the political landscape. Lastly, I will say this, the Trump strategy to win election is ultimately to pin the blame of the economic downturn on everybody else except for himself. And so that is one area that we're watching really carefully, whereas you see the president basically being the advocate for opening up the United States quickly, whereas his health officials are saying, don't do that. I think Trump wants to, in the end of the day, when Americans go to vote, they want the Americans to remember that Trump signed the check with his name on it. Yeah.
We need to go to the other speakers now.
Sure, absolutely. Happy to answer questions. Thank you.
I have other questions
Thank you.
Too. So Laura, the European Parliament had elections roughly a year ago. What has changed in Brussels since then, both before the epidemic, before the pandemic, and after the pandemic?
Well, thank you, Özgür. I think it can be argued that a lot has changed, but not much in the end. Because on the one hand, Corona has only exacerbated divisions that already existed within the European Union. And on the other, it has obliged the EU to shift some of the priorities of the working program of the new European Commission. We see now that priority number one is clearly to have an emergency response to this pandemic and to develop sound economic and social plans to address its impact in the coming years. There are other processes that were already in the pipeline and cannot wait until 2021 to be resolved. One of them is the multi-annual financial framework, and this will need to be discussed and agreed by the end of the year. And we also have Brexit, which in a way, if there's no extension of the transition period, we will have to deal with it at the moment. But as everything else goes, at the moment is put on a standby. We shouldn't also forget that the European Union has been going through a lot of other crises in the past, starting with the Eurozone crisis, but also the migration management one, which in most of the cases have left the European Union more weak and divided than before. And we are running the risk of also going through the same path if we don't learn from these lessons. But now we have on the table a number of issues that are at the core of European integration that we need to be dealing with in order to come out of this pandemic more strengthened. One is the functioning of the single market, because now the free movement of persons and goods is not guaranteed. And we have also been seeing export bans on medical equipment by some member states, also restoring the freedom of movement, Schengen. This was also, it was already during the migration management crisis, it was also put at risk. And we are going to be seeing how these controls are being lifted both internally and the external borders, but at the moment this is not being implemented. There's a need to agree on the distribution of the future EU recovery fund. The European Parliament has voted today on a 3 trillion bill on this, and this needs to be discussed among the different European countries, how it will be distributed, and giving the negotiations of the multi-annual financial framework, this will also need to be taken into account. And there also, we're seeing ghosts of the past as well. While the populist forces were kind of, they didn't succeed much in the past European Parliament elections. Now we are seeing how Euroscepticism and populism is again picking up, basically because of how the EU has been handling the coronavirus situation. The response has been negatively seen by the citizens because they feel in a way that they were left alone at the beginning, and because disinformation is playing again a big role. And lastly, we have to also have a discussion about what's the role that we want the EU to have in shaping the post-pandemic world. Here we have been seeing the EU leading multilateral efforts like supporting the World Health Organization and also driving international financing of medical research. But it remains to be seen, and while the EU is fighting a fight with China, sorry, the US with China, this is an opportunity now for this new geopolitical commission to stand up and play this role. So the Europe that will emerge from this crisis is clearly not going to be the same one that entered it, and therefore we need to change certain things. This is one of the aims of the Conference of the Future of Europe that has been recently postponed, but in the coming months we will be shaping this response. And the EU has been often blamed for everything, but we shouldn't forget that most of the core competences that we are talking about now, health, managing the borders, and economy, remain within the national capital. So the answer is more integration.
Laura, could you briefly talk about some of the political trends in the member states as a response to COVID?
Well, this has been, the response has been very different from one country to another. While we have been seeing a lack of solidarity at the very beginning of the crisis and an uncoordinated EU response, that has brought a lot of confusion and uncertainty. We have seen some member states applying tougher measures and calling for a state of emergency or a state of alarm, like in the Spanish case, and others have been applying much softer measures. We have also seen extremes, like the Hungarian case, where some of these emergency measures have been used to curtail freedoms and rule by decree. This was contested yesterday by a European Parliament resolution calling for sanctions and asking to stop payments to Hungary. So this is clearly being misused, this situation by some member states to further erode rule of law and democracy. We have also seen, and this depends on the dynamics, the internal dynamics of the different governments, whether it's a single party government in power or if it's a coalition government, how the different plans and strategies have been welcomed in the party. So in the country, sorry. So we see, like in some countries, have been showing a big political unity, but some others, in some others, the opposition parties have taken advantage of this critical moment to attack the government. We have also seen territorial tensions, the responses or the approach that some federal countries or semi-federal countries like Germany and Spain have been taken to give a response to the coronavirus fight has been completely different. While in Germany, the Länders were authorized as their government level to provide a response to this crisis. In Spain, for instance, the regions have not been equipped with the same responses and couldn't be dealing with it more directly. The reality is that not all member states have been impacted in the same way. And we've seen the situation in Italy and in Spain, while major countries, I would say, they have been affected more or less in the same way, and smaller countries have been affected less. We've seen success stories like Portugal, and we have seen other countries struggling more. Now we are slowly seeing a start to ease the restrictions depending on the progress of the pandemic, but we have good news coming from Spain and Italy, where the new cases of COVID continue to fall, and they are being able to slowly start to come out of the strict confinement period.
Thank you very much, Laura. I will have more opportunity to talk about these issues. Before I turn to Galip, for those of you that are joining this webinar series for the first time, if you have any questions, at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. You could use that Q&A button to ask your question. There is also, I realize, another function, a raise your hand function. Please don't use that one. The Q&A button is the only method we use to ask questions. So now we turn to Galip and to Turkey. So Galip, I will have two questions for you. The first one is, how has the municipal election last year, that took place roughly last year, transformed Turkish politics? Galip, you're muted.
How is it now? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Oh, sorry. Well, I think the most important effect of this election has been its impact on the political psychology of the people and the parties. Because for a long time, for 19, 20 years or 18 years, the election was the name of the game in which that many parties contends, but AK Party and Erdogan wins. And this created like a sense of political defeatism amongst the opposition circle, both at the base level, but also at the elite level as well too. I think one of the major change of this election was this has changed, because like, electorally, the opposition won in most of the big cities, and the AK Party itself, Erdogan himself knows very well the meaning of winning the election at the local level, because he comes from the local level as well too. Bearing in mind, with the change of the political system now, since the ministers are not elected but rather appointed, I think for instance, the seat of the Istanbul mayor is the second most important elected seat in country. So in this regard, the first impact has been on the change of the political psychology. Secondly, this process has introduced new actors into the political scenes. So we have right now the mayor of Istanbul, İmamoğlu, the mayor of Ankara, Mansur Yavaş, as the new, not only like, local figures, but like the national figures. And we see this clearly during this pandemic. In response to these pandemics, the main political battle took place between the government, the president, and then the mayors. So in this regard now, these mayors are not, the local figures, they are national leaders. The third one, I think, is we saw the maturity of the political base of the parties, particularly at the opposition level, because like for a long time, the government, betted on the idea that it's impossible to bring together the HDP and then the pro-Kurdish HDP and the nationalist good party within the same coalition, and therefore, we can easily win in Istanbul. But I mean, HDP, the E party was the official partner of the opposition coalition, and then the HDP was the unofficial partner of this coalition. And the opposition social base proved much more mature when it comes to voting, and they did not give into this politics of criminalization of the HDP. And another point is now we have new political parties. So it's not only new political actors, but we have now new political parties. The Davutoğlu launched his party, the Future Party. The Babacan launched his own party, the Remedy Party. So therefore, the political scene at multiple levels become much more plural. The opposition scene become plural, both in terms of the political identities and the political groups. And then in terms of the political actors, now we have a much more diversified political scene in Turkey.
Yes, and now I'm muted. Okay. So as a follow-up, how is the pandemic impacting all of this, both voter behavior and politics?
Well, I think the initial immediate impact of pandemic in Turkey has been similar to many other countries. Initially, as we see in many other contexts, the pandemic has created like the sense of emergency amongst the people, and that meant in return, the support for the whoever is in power, for the people who holds the executive powers, because we see that there was an increase in many places for the governments, particularly the leaders, be it the prime minister or the presidents, and the local actors became quite prominent, unless like the government really botched up like we saw with the Trump in the US. But when you look at like, even in places like Italy, we saw that there is an increase for the popularity of the prime minister has increased a bit. So I think a similar effect has happened in Turkey as well too. At the initial reaction, we saw that there has been an increase in the popularity of the president and the government. But that was the initial reaction, and I would be very skeptical of the polls now that is being shared with the public for two reasons. One of them is the methodology of the polls, because now the polls are being conducted through the phones, and that means the people's concern will be a bit heightened, particularly if they are supporting the opposition parties. So their likelihood of expressing their real opinion has decreased a bit. And the secondly is the shock effect of the pandemic, which will not last very long. We cannot measure immediately by the people's immediate reaction. So therefore, I will be a bit skeptical of whatever polls result that exists now. But the government effectively tried to use this process in an opportunistic way by introducing some of the unpopular laws during this pandemic. While the people were focusing on pandemics, we saw that the government is introducing a highly regressive association bills, which highly likely we might witness the coming of a very regressive social media bills using this pandemic is also as a pretext. We saw the government introducing quite regressive bills on the higher education, with the idea of closing down a Davutoğlu affiliated university as well too, as a part of the personal vendetta. And we saw the further sacking of the Kurdish mayors are ongoing. So in this regard, the government's politics of securitization will gain further pace during this pandemic. But I think the political response to these pandemics at the social base will be in two ways. One of them is the immediate response, which is very much driven by the people's sense of insecurity, facing, in a sense, an existential danger. That temporarily and immediately might have culminated in an increase in support for the government and for the president as well too. We saw through this, some of the polls. And also the government tried to undertake many international aid campaign for domestic political consolidation as well too. One of the aim of this was the domestic political consolidation. But at the same time, there will be a second type of the reaction that will be, in a sense, retrospectively built, and it will be cumulative. There we will be seeing the impact of the economic crisis, we will see the impact of the currency crisis, we'll see the impact of the social crisis, and there I think that will have much more, that will cause quite a lot of support for the governments, because as we see right now, the economy is doing quite badly. And now you have a government which on the one hand saying that I am helping everyone in the world through the coronavirus aid diplomacy, but at the same time says that everyone is still against me to get our economy. So that, I think that this schizophrenic mood will continue. But the last point, I think the governments will particularly, if we go for, which I don't think that we will be going, but if we go, let's say, for an election tomorrow, the government will try to build its whole election narrative around the health minister and then Turkey's medical and health industry.
Galip, early election will be a future question.
Okay.
So let's now turn back to Jonathan. Jonathan, you're muted, first of all. So mainly for the sake of our Turkish participants,
Sure.
Could you explain the mood in Washington about Turkey at the White House, at the Congress, at the institutions, but also among the wider public?
Yeah, I think what you were going to pose to Galip may have an impact on how people are viewing Turkey, both from the White House, but also from Congress. In Washington, there's always been different perspectives from the executive branch to Congress about Turkey. And I think in this case, you really have three divisions. The division of Trump himself and the personal relationship that he has with Erdogan. Then there is how the administration, whether it's the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, State Department, and other parts of the government view Turkey. And then there's Congress. One thing I do know is that there's deep sympathy when I'm talking to people both on the Hill, off the Hill, and the administration about the impact of the coronavirus on the Turkish public. And so I think there's an area of opportunity to work in that space, as I think there should be in terms of cooperation. And I think people do appreciate the planes that are being filled up with additional support. I don't think that changes that support. While welcome, and we're all in this the same pandemic and challenge right now, health-wise, doesn't change the dynamic of how the Hill, particularly in Congress, is looking at Turkey as it did 3 months ago. These key issues, including the S-400, even though for right now they seem to be mothballed, but without real any clarity from the government that it's going to be mothballed forever. And you still have concerns about Erdogan himself. And I keep hearing all these times it's U.S.-Turkish relations. It's really how people view Erdogan. There's a reason why the issue of Fed swaps. Turkey is going to need, Galip mentioned, the economic situation on the ground. Turkey is reaching out to partners saying, hey, look, we're giving you something, give us something in return. But the deficit of trust between Erdogan and how people, the institutions in the United States, forget about Trump for a moment, those that are going to help make a decision on such things as Fed swaps or macroeconomic support, that distrust remains. And so a lot of policy and how people are viewing support for Turkey runs through that lens of Erdogan. And I haven't seen a change in the US from the perspective of Congress, whether they want enforcement of Katz's sanctions as it relates to S-400s. That has not changed. The only thing that's changed is the attention level that congressional staff and members have right now in the middle of a coronavirus, because they have to deal with domestic issues and foreign policy is less on the radar. So right now, Özgür, the view of Turkey is one of sympathy towards the Turkish public, thinking about ways to support the Turkish public through this health crisis. It's great to have these people-to-people, whether it's medical or other things that are happening, but I don't see any change right now. I will say this, just going back to the question you asked, Galip, about the election. The mayoral election last year absolutely changed the dynamics, or at least the internal thinking in Washington, that there is a possibility that there might be another partner down the road in Turkey. That's up to the Turkish public to decide. That might be one that might be more amenable to working with the United States as a trusted partner, somebody that you can rely on in the sense of a president or a leader in Turkey that is different and providing a different perspective than Erdogan has for the last several years. And I'll just end with this. Regardless of what, there's these dynamics play out, everyone still values Turkey as a partner, wants Turkey to remain as a partner. And this is both Democrats, Republicans, and I don't think that's changed. It's a matter of the individual relationship with one particular leader in Turkey that has soured the relationship that even in the moment of the most extraordinary crisis, it's still in the DNA of how people are approaching Turkey. And I think that's it goes back to the question for, Turkish public and policymakers to help overcome that, and for others in the think tank community to find a way to rebuild the relationship. It's something that we've all been talking about for quite some time, but we still need to do. And even in the coronavirus, we still see these divisions. Over to you, Özgür.
Jonathan, back to you again. Don't mute. So very recently, the Battle of Idlib took place, in which Turkey clashed directly with the Syrian regime, and indirectly, or maybe even directly, with the Russian Federation as well. And there was tremendous diplomatic support to Turkey coming from Washington. Did this play any role in perceptions that Americans have on Turkey, particularly the policy circles?
Yeah, I mean, there's still a residue from the Trump withdrawal of, or wasn't full withdrawal, sort of Kurdish areas in northern Syria, and residue within, and still those members of Congress, and I think within institutions like the Pentagon, still unhappy about that. Idlib was certainly an opportunity, and I know it was debated as to what type of support the U.S. should provide. I think that the issue of the S-400s still sticks into, it penetrates this exact issue in practically everything. I think if you took the S-400 issue off the table, I understand how complex it is internally in Turkey for Erdogan and why he feels like he needs to have this, and the complex relationship with Russia, but it really sours that willingness for parts of the US government to take the step to work with Turkey. With that said, I think regardless of who's in office next, whether it's Trump or a Biden administration, this issue, that Syria issue, is going to remain incredibly relevant. The relationship with Russia, and we can go into this later, is going to be incredibly important. And let's not forget, in the middle of all this, Russia is suffering significantly right now. Economically, Putin's numbers are down significantly in his own country. And he's facing some challenges that make it less likely that he's able to act abroad in a way that he has before. And so I think there is a moment now too, Syria's a complex situation that the US, multiple administrations have managed to botch things, move some things in the right direction, but this will be an issue. So I don't think the opening is closed on cooperation in a number of different areas, whether it's in, as we see on some of the energy-related issues between Turkey and Israel, Black Sea security. There's a number of areas that I think, regardless of Democrat or Republican, are going to want to work with Turkey on. But I think there's still residue from some of these past issues that are still influencing opinion makers and policymakers within the U.S. government and on the Hill.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Laura, could you unmute, please? Because I am going to ask you a very similar question. What's the mood about Turkey in Brussels?
Well, it's because of different reasons. The mood is similar to the one in DC, but there's one main difference, that the European Union went through an institutional reshuffle. So we were presented last year after the elections with a new opportunity to restart this dialogue. So somehow we have a new leadership in place. We have new priorities. We have a new European Parliament composition. Not much has changed in the sense that the position of the main political groups on Turkey is it's still the same, but the MEPs have significantly changed. So now we see like 60% of the members of the European Parliament are new. We've seen shifts within the different political groups. The main two political groups, the European People's Party and the Socialists, have lost their majority, so they will need to look for support from other political groups in order to put forward some proposals. We have also seen some worrying developments after Brexit happened, like the fourth largest group now of the European Parliament is the Identity and Democracy one, where parties like Le Pen's party sit and some other Eurosceptical parties. We lost all the British MEPs who have been traditionally supportive of Turkey's accession. So in a way, it weakens the support that Turkey has traditionally had in the European Parliament for Turkey's accession. But as I said, we have a new group of members who are not necessarily have an opinion on Turkey or don't have a background that are worth exploring. And we have two key new faces in charge of the Turkey portfolio in the European Parliament that have been advancing a very constructive dialogue so far. One is the Turkey rapporteur and the other one is the new chair of the Joint Parliamentary Committee. We also see differences in the other European institutions, like the European Commission, where we have a new commissioner for neighborhood and enlargement. But we have already seen in these few months that Turkey has not been given the same enlargement perspective as the Western Balkans had. We have a new representative for foreign policy who's Spaniard and who knows Turkey very well and has very well established dialogue channels with Turkey. So this is something that it's worth looking at. And we have a new council that interestingly has and a new president of the European Council that has a lot of ambitions in foreign policy. So here we have seen an interesting shift because when at the beginning of this year, we saw some international crises happening in our neighborhood, like the Iran missile crisis or Libya, Louis Michel was the first one to come up with a statement and talk to different leaders around the world. And we have seen how with the Turkish leadership as well, the most common interlocutors have been Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, but also Louis Michel, and then Josep Borrell. So we see an interesting shift of the dialogue here. There are new opportunities for a re-engaged dialogue and a more open one, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a straightforward one because of the many issues that are lingering in the back from the previous years.
Talking of lingering issues, the pandemic escalated when Turkey and the European Union were in the middle of a new refugee crisis, which might be reignited once there is a return to normalization. So what are the ways forward in that crisis? I mean, is there a tendency in Brussels to work on a new deal with Turkey? Or is anger so high that nobody wants to make a new agreement with Turkey?
Well, I think now the problem is that the priorities are different ones. So now there's no more urgency of addressing this issue because the pressure at the border, it's not that it has disappeared, obviously, but there are other priorities that are occupying the minds of political leaders and policymakers. But this renovation of the deal will come back to the agenda because Turkey now has learned how applying pressure works. So this, in the end, we don't have any concrete results yet from that maneuver that took place at the beginning of March and where we saw horrific and dramatic images at the Greek-Turkish border. And this time, I don't think we can necessarily speak about a migration management crisis. I prefer to call it rather than a migration crisis, but it was provoked in this sense, and the pressure worked. I think that the EU-Turkey statement, which was originally intended to also give a new impetus to EU-Turkey relations by unblocking the accession negotiations and moving forward in other files like the customs union modernization or visa liberalization, has turned out to be a very poisonous gift. It has, in a way, now the core of our relationship is based on transactional case instead of having a more rule-based approach. And we are seeing the consequences of that. At the moment, indeed, Josep Borrell has been tasked along with Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu to come up with a more clarifying view of the implementation of the deal, because some of the measures that were agreed have not been implemented, and some others have never really worked, especially when it comes to sending refugees back to Turkey or having them resettled into the EU. This has never really happened in a very fluent way. So it remains a priority, and it will still be high on the agenda. But now I think there's a dialogue happening, and it's still going on. But at the moment, there's also kind of a deadlock on the expectations that each side has. So here, this will need to be worked around in a way that this doesn't mean necessarily a new deal, but reviewing parts of the deal that haven't been working. But this depends, again, on the political will of the two sides to deliver on the promises that were made. And in my opinion, I see some of the issues that are on the table require a lot of compromising and political will. So we will see whether this can be moved forward or not. And just before I forget that, I wanted to point out about the importance of maybe not only financial support is one of the issues that has been brought to the table, and now because of COVID it becomes even more important, because we've seen how an estimated 70% of Syrian refugees living in Turkey and benefiting from the humanitarian support coming from the European Union have lost their jobs in the past months. And 31% of children who are enrolled in schools cannot access an online curriculum. So we are going back now to having to assist refugees on the most pressing humanitarian needs, rather than looking like it was conceived to be looking at it in more long-term integration. So definitely here is where the EU will need to step up its efforts again to support the refugee community in Turkey again.
Thank you, Laura. Back to Galip, back to Turkish politics, but Galip, first you need to unmute yourself. So Galip, can you talk a little bit about alliance politics in Turkey and how the two new breakaway parties from the AK party fit into this alliance politics?
Well, I think one of the major differences, there is a qualitative difference between the different alliances in Turkey. The Nation Alliance and then the People's Alliance. The Nation Alliance is effectively an electoral alliance. It's made up of different political parties, different political identities. You have you have parties from the main opposition, secular CHP, to the small Islamist Saadet Party. You have the Nationalist Good Party to pro-Kurdish HDP. So therefore, it's a plural, it's much more plural. And as a result of it, having a plural political identities and political agendas, that also means that there will be much more friction between these groups. And recently, we have been seeing this between the HDP and then the good parties. And this is something, this friction is something that the government is investing and betting on as well, too. But I personally think, for the good party things that HDP doesn't have an option, because can the HDP switch the side to join the People's Alliance? No. And at the same time, the good party does not want to at least lose its base to the MHP, to the nationalist MHP. So to some extent, it tried to now and then differentiate itself from the CHP and be much more critical and hard-hitting on the HDP as well too. On the other hand, the HDP feels that it doesn't get any support, even though its support was crucial or indispensable for the opposition to gain many of the big cities, Istanbul, Ankara. But nevertheless, it doesn't in the aftermath of the election, it doesn't get anything. By what I mean by this is the fact that the government is cracking down on HDP mayors one after another. Today, I think we have 4 or 5 new HDP mayors removed from their offices. So around 60 out of the 60 HDP mayors, 44 or 45 of them has been removed from their offices with no judicial cases, with no verdicts, judicial verdicts. And the HDP feels it lacks any major solidarity from the from the opposition. So in this regard, the friction is there, but I think the social base of the parties once again proved to be much more pragmatic and much more mature on this regard. You don't.
Galip, what is the common denominator of this opposition alliance?
I think the main common denominator of the opposition alliance is anti-Erdogan and anti-AK party, basically changing the government structure in Turkey. So that's the common denominator. And this common denominator includes many different political parties. And I think this common denominator will still in one way or another hold them. So I don't think that despite this friction between them, I don't anticipate this will break down. But the People's Alliance is not an electoral alliance. It is a political alliance. And more than the political alliance, it's actually an alliance of political destiny. So what I mean by this, effectively, now you see the distinction between the AK party, the governing AK party, and the nationalist MHP is almost doesn't exist. The distinction between the Erdogan and then Bahçeli almost non-existing, putting aside the stylistic differences. So both parties feel that their political fates or their political destinies are more or less intertwined now. So now you have the AK party becoming more of like MHP and the Erdogan becoming more of like Bahçeli. And therefore you have a much more monolithic political language and political platform. So this is a political alliance, and I don't see this also crumbling anytime soon for a very simple reason. As I said, now both parties feels their political destinies are intertwined, and breakup means the loss for the both parties. So how does the new parties feature in this picture? I mean, first and foremost, we don't know at this stage whether the new parties will join any of the new political alliances or any of these political alliances, be it the nations or the People's Alliance, or whether they will try to set up a third way or a third bloc. This is the developments in the coming times will show. But what is important at this stage is since the advent of the multi-party system in Turkey, the politics effectively meant the contest between the existence of the multiple parties on the right or the conservative spectrum of the politics. So when the existence of the multiple parties on the right and conservative spectrum of the political spectrum effectively meant the political competition was taking place in a real sense. When you have all these nationalists or right-wing or the conservative circle coalescing around one single platform, that effectively means the political dominance, not real room for the competition. So in this regard, the emergence of new parties on the conservative or the right side of the political spectrum will, to some extent, means bringing back the politics as well too. The second, I think, one of the most important, we have to make a two-level analysis. Can these new parties pose a political challenge to the government? The answer to this is yes. There is arithmetic of it, there is politics of it. Arithmetic of it, now we are talking effectively 49 to 51 or 50-50 or 48 to 52 equilibrium in Turkey. So any votes counts no matter how little it is. So that. The politically, you see this from the response of the government, from the response of the President Erdogan. I mean, the move to basically to close down the Davutoğlu affiliated Istanbul Şehir University or appoint the government trustee to Davutoğlu affiliated the art and science foundations to punish him effectively means how much danger or how much discontent the existence of these new parties is generating amongst the government. The media bans on both Davutoğlu and Babacan also illustrated. So what these parties can do is actually, they can further contribute into the Turkey's opposition scene getting even further plural, but even more importantly, they can make the Turkish conservative political spectrum much more plural, because for a long time Erdogan didn't want any new claimant to exist for the Turkish conservative political side. So here now you will have new contender that will be vying for the hearts and minds of the conservatives in Turkey. So that in return will actually make it more difficult when the president uses us and us versus them, versus them language, because now within the versus them language, there will be like conservative, Islamists, Kurds, etc. I mean, that doesn't mean that he will not use it. He will still use it. But I think the political gains that he can make from this is highly limited. So the last point is whether they can succeed it arithmetically. What will be the result that they will get? I think the first, it will be dependent on how fast and how deep the AK Party's political decline will continue, because in the end, the biggest chunk of the voters they will get from there. And the secondly, obviously, what they do, like as a political parties. And then thirdly, right now there is a growing number of the voters. Different polls puts them at different range, like 1/3, or even like some people put as much as high. Almost 1/3 of the Turkish political voters says that they are not represented by any of the existing parties. That doesn't mean that they will immediately vote for these new parties, but at least it shows that there is a potential for the new parties to tap into it.
Thank you very much, Galip. Back to Jonathan. Yes, so Jonathan, you have listened to Galip. I mean, not long ago, I think in some cases we were together at these meetings, people would argue that there are no longer real elections in Turkey, that elections in Turkey are a farce, and that President Erdogan would one way or another win each and every election in Turkey in the future. But now Galip is explaining that, I mean, apart from the fact that he lost the municipal elections, Galip is now explaining that the upcoming election in Turkey is by no means predetermined. Are people in Washington aware of this? How closely are they following the developments in Turkey? And is this playing a role in their policies or in their understanding towards Turkey?
Yeah, I think there's a, look, I view this as the most dynamic Turkish political scene in quite some time, since the early 2000s. And so I think there's, for those who are Turkey watchers in terms of sense of policymakers, opinion makers, the election last year was really something quite significant in terms of factoring what Turkey might look like going forward. And the truth is, Özgür, your point was that I think a lot of people did think that the government would do everything it could do to ensure that it won that election in Istanbul. And they did try to do many things from the outside perspective to try to preserve their power in these spaces. And so, things that the current government can't overcome in Turkey is the economy. And the economy, even during the last election, was not good. And so it hasn't been good for quite some time. But I think people are certainly calculating in Washington, trying to figure out what will happen. Will there be an early election? But they're also calculating if there's no early election and the current power structure remains, then they're going to have to continue to deal with the current government. And can I just say one thing too? As much as people are watchers of the political scene, I think the interaction between the new political players, like the new mayors, Babacan, Davutoglu are known entities in the U.S., but there really isn't a dynamic conversation, and I don't know if this is the same case in Brussels as well, between these new political parties and American counterparts. There really hasn't been a strong effort, I think I would say, on both sides, both Washington and Ankara, U.S., Turkey, to actually establish stronger relations with these new parties, at least just to understand, invite them in, hear about what their vision is for Turkey and for a relationship with the United States, because the U.S. is frankly so unpopular in Turkish polls. Politically, I can understand why Turkish officials or even new parties may not want to be seen as engaging or theoretically embracing the relationship based on their own political needs. The U.S. doesn't seem to be at the top of the agenda of politicians in Turkey. And certainly right now, if you're a mayor, what you're focusing on is it coronavirus, how to address those issues. But I think there's a space for these new parties, even old partners like Davutoglu or Babacan, to get a better understanding of how they would reshape relations with the West. or what they expect back from the West. Back to you, Özgür.
Thank you, Jonathan. Laura, could you unmute? So I will ask a similar question, somewhat similar question to you, but of course I know that in Brussels there are several people who follow Turkey very closely, and I think that Brussels is aware that Turkish elections, even if they are not entirely fair, they are free and the opposition has a real chance of winning. So how does this new fact play a role in perceptions about Turkey in Brussels?
I think when the local election took place last year, the mood was so down in Brussels that it was hard to believe somehow what ended happening, because the situation is that we have been at one of our lowest points for such a long time, and the limits of this relationship has been tested so many times that we need a lot of reasons to continue being optimistic about it. The relations between Turkey and the EU have been downgraded so many times in the past years that now we are seeking ways to bring them aboard again, because the European Parliament somehow has been in repeated resolutions calling to freeze the relationship, then threatening to suspend if there were no improvements in human rights or rule of law issues, then asking to formally suspend, then the Council adopting similar conclusions on no chapters being opened or closed, or moving forward in the customs union, having sanctions in the case of the Eastern Mediterranean. We have been seeing so much, there has been a fatigue, I would say, when it comes to Turkey. So I don't remember at that time having seen a lot of debates or discussions in Brussels taking place after the local elections, unfortunately. There have been more efforts to somehow have more contacts at the local level with Turkey, and there have been some European institutions doing this. The Committee of the Regions has one a program where they have been in touch with local authorities in Turkey for a long time, and this became a more refreshing venue to discuss some of the issues that actually are impacting equally Turkey and Europe. So I think at the political level, the relationship is very damaged, and now we need to find ways to how to proceed in all these aspects, and this is what we're trying to look for new narratives at every possible level. But of course, it's not only that dialogue happens with the government in place, but also happens with opposition parties, with civil society in the country, with experts, academics, with business organizations. So in that sense, the channels are open, but need to be reinforced. And now I feel like there has been a slowdown of all of this. And I think it's important to start reconnecting again with Turkey at all possible levels of dialogue to discuss how can this relationship be put on track.
Thank you very much, Laura. So the last round of questions, but maybe the panelists aren't provocative enough because I don't see too many questions coming from the audience. So if you have any questions, this is the right time to ask them using the Q&A function. So Galip, one theme that has come up more than once during this panel discussion is if there will be early elections in Turkey. So when do you expect the presidential and parliamentary elections to be held? Whether you expect early elections, and what factors will determine the outcome?
Well, I mean, do I expect a snap election or early election? No, I don't. Do I think that we will be waiting until 2023 for the election? No, I don't think so as well too. So I think we will have an election before 2023, but it will not be a snap election either later this year or the earlier 2021. The reason that I'm thinking so is the following. So if you are Erdogan, who still has like, more than 3 years mandate, why to risk it for extra 2 years? Just in order to get like extra 2 years, you are risking 3 years. Secondly, I mean, if you let's say that you will hold an election in fall, we are talking about like a major economic contraction this year. the economy is expected, like, by different institutions to contract something like 5%. And the last year, the government projected 5% growth actually for the country. Now, like, many places are expecting a contraction of 5% or a bit lower or a bit higher. And particularly the second and the third quarter will be the most severe one for the Turkish economy. So you don't want to go to election right after a major economic slowdown and then associated increase in the unemployment and the ongoing currency crisis. You have to get like the consent of the MHP to go to election. This is not a decision that Erdogan will make on his own. Erdogan, on all major decisions, he has to get the approval of the MHP, and then MHP, and then Batalla is the effective partner and a very influential partner as well too. And if you are an MHP with a 10% of the electoral support, that you are almost like running the country, at least your political agenda, you are bearing that much influence. Would you want to lose it? Like, in what other context can you get like can you be more influential? Let's in the late 1990s, the MHP was a coalition partner. If you ask me whether the MHP as a coalition, official coalition partner with the Ecevit and Yilmaz, whether the MHP bear more influence then or now, I will, without any hesitation, I will say that MHP now has much more influence with only 10% of the electoral support. And then another factor is related to the mayors. The AK Party wants the new mayors to do badly, in a sense, to weaken them, to take their image before any election. Now, none of them has happened. To the contrary, actually, as the pandemic shows, like the fortune of the Ankara mayor is actually on rise. The İmamoğlu is not doing badly as well too. I mean, most of those polls still show either he maintains his support or even there is a bit of increase in this result. And the last things, this sudden electoral decision might come across as an irresponsible opportunism for the public, because in a sense, like similar to the decision of opening the shopping malls, which most of the public still thinks that is not, it's not very popular. So at a time when many countries actually is arguing or discussing to even cancel some of the election in 2020 because of the impact of the coronavirus, you declaring that you are going an early election might not come across as a responsible decision. Having said this, but if there is a major thing that the government can pull around, let's say the HDP declared that it's not going to take part in the, it's not going to support any opposition bloc, it's going to go a third way, then the whole dynamics can change. But as the things stand, I don't think that there will be but despite this, why do people still talk about, despite the factors that stands against an early election, why do people still talk about an early election? I think it's the psychology of it. In 1990s, we used to talk about like election all the time because like, the country was crisis stricken. So when you have like experienced a crisis after crisis, be it the economic crisis, unemployment crisis, etc., then the political mood, it changed to idea that whether there will be some, something on horizon for the change. And secondly, the AK Party's moves or the government's moves, which comes across as, the political opportunity moves, gives this image to the people. Like what I mean by this, the recent, I mean not recent, like the steps of like the further criminalization of the opposition, going after the HDP mayors, all those things makes people to think that the government has something in his hand or planning something. But I personally don't think that we will have an early election. If there is an election, what will be the determining factors? I mean, obviously, it will be the economy. Now, the unemployment is the economy. We're already in an economic crisis, which is set to get worse. The unemployment is rising, which is set to, get further risen, particularly for the youth unemployment. And then another factor will be very much, another determining factor will be the performance of the mayors, because like right now, all the talks about whether one of or two of these mayors will go to national politics. So the performance of mayor will be also another determining factor, whether the people will think this mayor succeeded in their mandate or not. Another factor will be basically the nature of the, the health of the coalition between the MHP and AK Party, but also the opposition coalition as well too. Particularly whether the pro-Kurdish HDP will remain part of this opposition coalition, and then the performance of the new political parties, to what extent these new political parties will make or will eat into the government's base. So all these factors will have an impact on the government's performance or the electoral performance of the different parties in the case of an election. But in my opinion, the odds doesn't look good for the government.
Galip, I will pick on one point. So what would determine whether the HDP supports the opposition or not? Because that will be one of the crucial factors.
Well, I mean, it's very hard to answer this. I mean, on the one hand, as I said, the HDP, the major motivation for HDP to, in a sense, support the opposition with nothing in return was its priority of basically defeating Erdogan. So the number one priority for HDP in the in the local election was to defeat, in a sense, the Erdogan and the AK Party. So in whether this will be still the motivation for the HDP, it also will depend how the government will continue in the upcoming times vis-a-vis the Kurdish question, both inside Turkey and outside Turkey. Whether it can do anything on this front as well too. Whether the Öcalan, we might see once again Öcalan being the part of the discussion as well too. But I think that as the things stand, the HDP's motivation that motivated it to join the opposition coalition prior to the local election is still there, despite its discontent with the opposition, thinking that it's not seeing enough solidarity in the face of the government crackdown on its mayors. But again, we might see some surprises as well too. Particularly, the HDP will not support the government coalition, but I think the government's goal will be whether it can peel away the HDP from the opposition bloc to go its own way, in a sense, like the third way.
Thank you very much, Galip. So, Jonathan, going back to the US elections, what factors will determine the outcome of the elections in the United States, and how relevant is the outcome for US-Turkey relations?
Yeah, I think what Galip just said about going into an election with the economy in such poor shape, and I think a lot will really depend on whether or not, and I think we all are going to likely see an up and down. So the economy is what really is going to impact Trump, particularly among independents. The response to the coronavirus, which I think we're going to see different variations over a number of months. Trump is engaged right now really in a division. He's supporting those groups. If you're watching in the US, you're seeing this division of those that want to open up states right away. They want to do away with some of the social distancing, or won't wear masks, or want to open up bars. We had in Wisconsin, you could see scenes of bars being filled up with people completely going against the health recommendations of Trump's own people, and then Trump coming out and supporting that. So the elections are largely going to depend one on the issues that are going to be prevalent, which includes the economic issues, which I don't see any type of quick recovery. I don't think there's anybody who sees that. So I think he's in a particularly tough point for that. And the other one is just the election modalities. How is this election in November going to be carried out in states to ensure safety, security, transparency? The United States has, in the 50 states, plus the District of Columbia where I am, every one of these states has different election modalities. And they need to be working right now to ensure that if it's vote by mail or it's in person, that the right precautions are being put in place. And I think, of course, the US is looking at what took place in South Korea, is looking at other countries where elections have been held to see how best to do this. But there is, in the background of all of this, is the concern that somehow the election in the U.S. won't happen in a free and fair manner. And that is largely up, one, to the federal government working with states and localities across the United States. And I think it's so relevant that you're getting letters from very prominent human rights, but also those that have been long involved in elections in the United States, writing letters to the administration, Congress as well, saying, you've got to prepare right now. So we have two problems. The question is, will the will of voters on November 3rd be actually carried out in the coronavirus situation? And I think it's a real issue. And I think we'll be talking about this in the US from now into the election. But the major issues that we see right now are really the ones revolving the response to the coronavirus, the economic situation. This is largely a domestic election right now, based on where the economy is, how bad the unemployment levels go. And I think the foreign policy issues will be less relevant right now, except for the blame game. And I think that's where you see the administration trying to focus Trump administration, trying to focus the attention on China, because at the end of the day, Trump wants to be able to say, this economy and its failures, hey, it's not my fault, it's China's fault. The deaths in the United States, hey, if China had just acted responsibly, this wouldn't have happened. And he's famous for not taking blame for anything that goes wrong, but credit for everything that everybody else does. And so I'm expecting, this is his playbook. And so I'm expecting this to be the case. The question is, will there be enough people to buy that line, his line, during the election? And looking at the numbers the way they are today, no. In fact, it's more likely that there is a potential for the Democrats. Let's not forget, the election in November is also about Congress. And it looks right now as if Democrats will continue to hold a House of Representatives. It's quite possible Democrats could retake the Senate. So even if Trump wins, politics may also change the dynamics of those who can hold him accountable. It's more likely to go in the direction of Democrats than Republicans right now. And I don't see the dynamics changing between now and then. But the modalities of the election, whether they'll happen in a way that's fair and free, that's in question.
And Jonathan, what changes for Turkey if Trump loses?
I think what you're going to see, look, there's a Trump second administration, which you can talk about, and then the potential for Biden administration. Joe Biden is a veteran in foreign policy, both as vice president, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I think for Turkey, what you're likely to see is somebody who knows Turkey quite well, and during his vice presidency engaged with Turkey on a number of issues, including ISIS. There was a famous apology that Biden came back with when talking to Turkish officials about their role with ISIS. I think Biden is well aware of what's going on. I think you'll see a stronger push on support for NATO in a very different way, on the stronger support for the transatlantic relationship. U.S. leadership role stepped up again globally, a different approach in the Middle East, particularly to Iran, not with Israel. I don't expect significant changes in that relationship. And with Turkey, I think Biden will still value the relationship with Turkey. But the difference I see is that Biden has spoken a lot about taking on the issues of democracy, human rights, authoritarianism, corruption. And he is, I think, somebody who's likely to put more resources and U.S. engagement in those spaces. So for Turkey, being an important part of NATO, yes, but a Turkey that maybe is acquiring or has weapons like S-400, I see, I can't speak for Biden, but I can see, of course, whatever administration comes in, we'll have to think about these situations based on the moment, but I can see it more likely where he would want to enforce Katz and hold people accountable. Let's not forget about the role of Russia in the previous election, particularly for Democrats, and how they view the relationship between Turkey and Russia, or Turkey and China. So I think a new sheriff is going to come to town if it's Biden, with incredible amounts of foreign policy experience. But I think he will try to put U.S. back on the map again externally on relationships and dealing with global issues from China to climate change to multilateralism. And I think you'll see a much closer relationship with Europe if the European side is ready and willing. But for Turkey, I think you could see an administration that maybe starts to tilt the relationship to a focus not just on security matters, but one of relationship and values. Something I hear more from the EU side when it deals with Turkey than you hear from the US. And I think that's been long overdue. And for those people who misread the Turkish public's perspective on voting in 2018, Turkey's not monolithic. And I think the US had missed opportunities over the last dozen years to really engage and enrich the relationship with Turks from different political stripes. And I don't think that mistake will happen again.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So Laura, last but not the least, once this pandemic is over, during the next decade or so, what will be on the agenda of EU-Turkey relations, both positive and negative?
Well, I think it's the same topics that we have been long time dealing with, which is putting somehow under trying to understand what to do with the accession process. I think we are going to be starting a reflection period now about where we want this relationship to go. And I think it's important to make some progress there, at least, because it has so far been completely dysfunctional. But at the same time, no alternative framework has been put forward. So in that sense, it has become very difficult to really solve some of these issues in the long run. And at the same time, Turkey has become highly unpredictable and unreliable in some issues, especially in foreign policy. So in that regard, I think we are bound to cooperate. So as I mentioned before, it's the customs union, probably the area where if there would be political will and some reforms were made from the Turkish side, we could see kind of an improvement there. There were high hopes about the upcoming German presidency that would take over this file and maybe break the deadlock there. But now, of course, I think the German presidency will have other pressing issues to deal with the pandemic. So it will be difficult, but I think migration will continue to be there. I mean, it's a global phenomenon, and Europe is at the core of it. So I think there will be also, the economy will play a big role there as well, because not only of the economic crisis that we have been long hearing about in Turkey, but also now Europe will also go through an economic crisis of its own, and taking into account that Turkey relies heavily on Europe for its exports. I mean, this is going to be also painful for Turkey, because at the end of the day, there's no other better Europe anchor than Europe is for Turkey. So I think this will continue in the coming months. This will be, I think I haven't mentioned any positive one, but I think it's a matter of sitting on the table and then discussing these issues widely. But now there's no urgency for such, and some things are being put on hold. But it will have to continue one way or another. I mean, the risk of a political break, it's not possible, because there are way too many mutual interests on the table to ruin this relationship.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, all three of you. Angela, you have the floor, and my apologies for leaving you only 10 minutes for the question and answer session.
Hope we will manage it. Thank you, Özgür. And hello, everyone. Happy to join you with the Q&A session. And without further ado, I will just jump into the question. The first one is from Danya Hatip, and it's for Galip. Do you think the COVID-19 will push Erdogan to strike a deal with Putin on Syria, maybe dividing the country into zones of influence?
Well, I mean, Erdogan and Putin, or Turkey and Russia, always struck a deal. The trouble is this deal is unstable, and then the boundaries and there is already the zone of influence in Syria between different countries, but particularly when it comes to Turkey, the boundaries of this zone of influence is changing quite dynamically. Effectively means, it's getting shorter and shorter. So I don't think that the COVID-19 at this stage will be a major determinant of the conflict. So the trajectory that we have seen before the COVID-19 will more or less continue after the COVID-19. So I don't see a grand bargain that will stabilize the conflict at a new level.
Thank you. The next couple of questions are also for you, Galip, and there's also one comment. You already touched upon the new parties, but these are also on the new political scene. And the first one is from Güney Yıldız. He's a visiting fellow SWP Center for Applied Turkey Studies. Pandemic has in a way slowed down political contest in Turkey, especially as main opposition and the new political parties are unable to hold public events and meetings. Do you think under pandemic, the time is on the government side or that of the new political parties? In other words, could pandemic cause the new political parties to lose momentum? The next one is also again on the new political parties, and this is from Weizsäcker. Some polls have shown that the new parties will draw most of their votes from people who already support the opposition. What are the prospects for the new parties pulling more than 20% of AKP voters away from Erdogan? And the last one is from Jasper Mortimer, and he has a comment as well. Davutoğlu and Babacan are bright, but they are not good public speakers. They cannot mobilize a crowd. I put it to you and that either of their parties will be lucky to get 5% of the vote. And his question is, once Devlet Bahçeli retires from the stage, will the MHP lose its share of the vote, falling below 10%? Over to you, Galip.
Oh, thank you. Well, starting with the Güney's question, the time frame is important. I mean, during March and then April, the government was a bit more lucky because like the focus was on the pandemic and the people had like this major fear. So therefore, like people were not in a mood to listen to other voices. But I think right now we are moving from a pandemic crisis or a health crisis to a socio-economic crisis. If the health crisis that boosted the government, I think the socio-economic crisis is going to weaken the government. So in this regard, yes, at the initial stage of the pandemic, it was a boost for the government, a temporary boost for the government, and an unlucky situation for the opposition parties, particularly for the new parties, as they didn't have much public space to showcase their own parties. But as we are moving from the health crisis, in a sense, to socio-economic crisis, which Turkey is fastly entering, then I think this will once again open up the opportunity spaces for the political actors, including the new political parties as well too. So in this regard, no, I don't think that the pandemic, if we are talking about 3-4 months from now, will be a win for the government. I think like highly likely it will have a negative impact on the government as the outcome of the pandemic, which is the economic crisis, which is the social crisis, will be much more deeply felt. And then the second question on the Weizsäcker's questions. Well, Dov, I mean, there is some polls that shows the new parties are getting a bit of from different political parties, but still, particularly in the case of Davutoğlu, the big chunk of the votes that he has to get from the AK Party, the conservative votes. So maybe like Babacan can eat a bit more into the İYİ Party, good parties votes. But I think like in the end, for the both parties to be successful, they have to get the votes from the AK Party, from the opposition. So mainly they will have their eyes set on the votes of the AK Party, because A, this is the big block of the votes that they will get. B, I don't think that they can get much votes from the CHP or HDP. I mean, a bit maybe. I mean, they can get a bit from the İYİ Party, good party, but still the big block is the AK Party's votes. So whether they can get like most of it or not is not only dependent on what they do, but also how fast this decline of the AK Party will continue. If this decline of the AK Party, aggravated by the economic crisis, aggravated by the upcoming crisis, become fast and deeper, then I think they will eat into these votes much more than that they are doing now. But if it doesn't happen, let's say like, if AK Party still could more or less maintain its social base, then their prospect, their electoral prospect will be dimmer. On the other question, it was
Devlet Bahçeli retires.
Devlet Bahçeli. Well, in politics, there is no retirement in Turkey. So that effectively means that, if when Devlet Bahçeli dies, what will happen? Well, I think it depends on two things. One of them is who is going to come afterward, because when you have completely leader-centric parties, there is no second man, because second man is always a danger. So now you have the first man and then the 100 man. So in this regard, I don't think that there is a second man in MHP. So the Devlet Bahçeli's death, for sure, it will create like a crisis. But again, it will depend like who is going to come after him. And that doesn't automatically means that he's going to go under 10% just because of Devlet Bahçeli is leaving the scene. So it will more depend on the responses that MHP will generate to this disappearance, and whether we might see like, a charismatic figure or not. But in the end, the MHP has a strong, is like premise on a very strong political identity, nationalism. And now the nationalism in Turkey is on the rise. I mean, there is a crisis of nationalism, but it's still a major political figure similar to conservatism. And there will always be a base for this. Any question that I missed?
These are all for the moment. And
Okay.
let me just turn to Jonathan. There are two questions for you, so I'll just read them together. One is
Sure.
from Javier. What is the main point behind State Department to provide a detailed account of Erdogan's net wealth and income, along with that of his family members? How critical is this for the US government? And the other one is from Lincoln McCurdy, and it follows as, I concur with Jonathan's excellent summary of the congressional on the US-Turkey relation. Question is, do you think that there will be a swap between Turkey and the Federal Reserve?
Yeah. On the first question, I don't really have details on that particular information. I think some of the topics that are dominating sort of Washington related to Turkey, for example, include Mike Flynn, which we didn't talk about today. That somehow this topic, we didn't talk about Turkey's role in the election, including Flynn. But there's a likelihood that Turkey and sort of what took place pre-2016 election is going to come up again in the context of hearings in the Senate, where you're going to bring up Turkey's role of Turks providing funding to Mike Flynn, who ended up being the national security advisor for Trump, but then left based on lying to the FBI. So that's likely to come up, but I don't know specifically about sort of the detailed information.
Can I weigh in on the Erdogan's net worth issue?
Yeah.
It actually came up in a sanctions package. I don't remember the name, that actually passed the House and also passed the Foreign Affairs Commission of the Senate, and is yet not brought to the floor, to the Senate floor. One of the categories of sanctions in that package is that the State Department would calculate President Erdogan's net worth. So if that package passes, not only Katz would be implemented in a month after the package passes, not only would there be other sanction categories, but also this would come up. This is how it has come up.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't realize it was related to the sanctions question, and I didn't know if it was something that's come up recently in the press. But I wanted to just talk, maybe just switch. Thank you, Özgür. And I know there's some people who are sort of tuning out on this who are actually pretty intimate with these type of efforts on sanctions and the things that took place in December last fall, going into now with Katz and other related sanctions. But on the Fed swaps, I thought Ambassador Satterfield, and I think the responses on that have been pretty clear, that the U.S. wants to make certain in terms of Fed swaps that it's a government that they can trust. And I think, how they're calculating those countries that they want to help and engage is going to be based on trust, interest. The Fed says, or, sort of the response from the U.S. side says, well, politics doesn't play a role in the decision-making on this type of support, but that's not true. And the stronger there is of a partnership between the United States and the country can and does impact these types of swaps. It impacts macroeconomic support. And my expectation would be if there's some type of Fed swap or if there's some type of macro support from the IMF and the US is involved, then it should also come with conditionality. And that conditionality could include everything from, and I would expect that EU partners and others might be interested and also focused on this as well, particularly NATO partners, on the permanent mothballing of S-400s or on issues such as release of journalists or Turkey addressing some of the democratic deficiencies. And I don't think that the macro support should come without conditionality.
Thank you. And there is one question that, Laura, maybe you can pick this up. And this is from Joseph Sattler. What's the rationale for the EU or its member states of putting more political capital on the line by engaging with Turkey, while any return on benefits will probably not have immediate or even midterm positive results given the situation?
Thank you. Well, the reason is that Turkey still remains a candidate country to the European Union unless a decision is made otherwise. And this has been a long story of up and downs, but now I think the EU has more to gain from it, especially after they signed this deal on migration. So I think what the European Union doesn't want is to take care of these 3.6 million refugees that Turkey is hosting. So in that regard, I think the major mistake was to turn that deal into a transactional effort rather than putting aside and at the expense of all human rights issues and rule of law. So now we are kind of trapped in that. We cannot engage Turkey. It seems difficult to engage Turkey to come back to respecting those principles, and we are seeing every day still violations of human rights in the country. So this is the main, this is where all the political engagement needs to go to, and this is what the European Parliament has been advocating mostly. It's not, I think if the EU would have had a sound asylum and political policy of its own, we wouldn't have ended with this deal that we are now prisoners of.
Thank you, Laura. So we are almost, time is up, but we still have two more questions, and these are for Galip. Galip, if you can just be brief while answering them, that would be great. One is from Kaji Tashtan. He's from GMF. Do you think that the economic considerations will change Ankara's tone in the foreign policy issues, especially in its narrative with the West? And the second one is from Naz Durakolu. The hurdles that opposition parties face in Turkey are far greater than most other parties in other democracies. Given Erdogan's omnipresence in every aspect of Turkish society and politics, including foreign policy, how can the EU and the US best engage directly with Turkey's population and its opposition? Are they doing so effectively? Are there other countries that are engaging more effectively with Turkey's population? Can we borrow any lessons from those countries, if such examples exist? Galip, can you please unmute?
Sure. To Kaji's question, yes, we will see the softening in the tones of the government vis-a-vis the West. I mean, it's already discernible, but at the same time, it will be like, you know, a double-edged discourse. On the one hand, you will see the softening of it because of the necessity of the economy, but on the other hand, the more the economy gets worse, the more that you will be blaming on the foreign actors. And in Turkey's context, foreign actors has to mean West. So you cannot say, like, you know, the Indian and the Papua New Guinea is, like, you know, basically targeting Turkish economy. So the name that you have to use, it has to be either English are after us, like British English are after us, or the German are after us, or American are after us. So these are the contents that will resonate with the public. So yes, there will be the softening of the tone, But at the same time, we will have, once again, the conspiracy theory center on the West targeting the Turkish economy. On the second question, I mean, I don't have a strict answer to this question, to be honest. So I maybe like Özgür and others can have a better answer on this. But what is important, I think the West basically sticking to the democratic standards and sticking to the normative language as well too in its engagement with Turkey. But to do so, the West has to have, like, basically credibility and integrity. During the 2000, for instance, during some of the major engagement between the Turkey and the West, the logic of the democracy or the logic of the values was not there in this engagement. It was effectively like, the pragmatic and transactional engagement. So in this regard, the idea of what West can do, well, in the end, the future of Turkish democracy will be decided by the people in Turkey themselves. So I don't think that the outside actors will have a major role to play. So it will be people in Turkey that will shape the future of Turkish democracy. So if anything else can be done on this regard, or anyone else has opinion, maybe Özgür has something different, I would like to hear as well too. But for me, as it stands, it will be effectively a domestic battle in Turkey.
Thank you, Galip. Over to you, Özgür. These are the questions. These were the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Ceylan. Well, I mean, regarding Nazır's question, I believe that the only policy for Turkey's Western allies is actually strategic patience. As Galip said, I don't think that engaging Turkish opposition will change anything in Turkish politics. On the other hand, while showing strategic patience, in discourse, Turkey's Western allies should distinguish the current Turkish government from Turkey and the Turkish state, because as a matter of fact, some of the criticisms towards the Turkish government actually are taken by the Turkish public as criticisms towards Turkey, the Turkish people, the Turkish society. So there should be a very clear distinction in these messages. So for the sake of time, let me stop here. Let me thank all of you for bearing with us. Next week, again at this time on Friday, we'll have a webinar on state of coronavirus in Turkey. We'll have 3 speakers. Professor Evren Balta will inform us about the health issues, health aspect of the crisis. Professor Güven Sak will inform us about the state of Turkish economy. To be honest, not too many Turks are willing to talk about the Turkish economy currently. So Professor Sak is taking a brave step with this. And we'll have Soli Özel talking about the political aspects and also the foreign policy aspects of the crisis. And you will all receive invitations to this webinar as well. And we would love to see you with us. And with this, let me close this webinar and thank all of you for being with us, although digitally only. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.